Many thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. Now, don't get me wrong, exposure bracketing undeniably has its place in a photographer's toolkit. It's just not a one-size-fits-all solution to achieving a perfect exposure. So within the realm of digital photography and particularly landscape photography, exposure bracketing has long been hailed as the foolproof method to ensure optimal exposure in difficult lighting conditions. However, as camera technology, advances and photographers refine their skills, it's becoming increasingly evident that bracketing exposures isn't always a requirement for capturing a perfectly exposed image. And in this video, I'll share with you how to determine whether or not you actually need to bracket your exposures. And from my personal experience, most of the time I used to exposure bracket, I was really just wasting my time. So I organized this video into 4 parts. Photos that don't require bracketing, photos that may require bracketing, photos that do require bracketing, and how you can tell the difference when you're out in the field and on location. So why should you even care about this? If you're a digital photographer, can't you just exposure bracket everything, right? And just figure it all out when you get home? And the short answer is yes, that's certainly one approach that you could take. But my argument to that thinking is that if you fully understand exactly when you should and when you shouldn't, or when you need to and when you don't need to exposure bracket, you will be a better photographer. So for one, and this isn't even the main reason, but for one, it's gonna save you time. You know, if you do a 3-shot exposure bracket and you exposure bracket everything, you're basically tripling the amount of photographs you take. So that's gonna waste time in the field, and it is definitely going to waste your time when you're in the digital darkroom, culling through your photographs, figuring out, what you need versus what you don't need, and trying to clean up and find the gold amongst all the photographs that you took on a particular trip. So that's one advantage. But the big one is understanding your camera's limitations. Every camera today has limitations, and understanding what your camera can and can't do is huge. You'll be a better photographer if you understand that. Understanding the relationship between light versus shadow, how to read a scene that's unfolding in front of you, and also how to read your histogram and to fully understand what your camera can do in a single photograph versus what your camera needs to rely on exposure bracketing in order to accomplish. By understanding all of that, you will be not only a better photographer, but you'll also be a more confident photographer in your own skill set, along with what your gear can and cannot do. So as far as the photographs that you really don't need to exposure bracket, so this is a scene this is actually the edited photo, but I just captured this last week in my Norway workshop. And this is the type of scene right here that I always used to exposure bracket. So full disclosure, when I got into photography, I guess it was maybe year 2, I learned about exposure bracketing pretty early on. And when I figured out how to set it up in my camera, well, I exposure bracketed everything. My thought was just bracket it all just in case you needed it. Well, I'll tell you what, the just in case scenarios really never happened. I didn't use hardly any of the exposure bracketed photographs that I ended up taking because most of those scenes look like this right here. This is not a high dynamic scene. There is not a lot of contrasting light. There are some shadows down here, and there is a sky that is a little bit brighter, but nothing in this scene here is out of the realm of a modern digital camera today. Most cameras today have, I'd say on the low end, maybe average of 10 stops of dynamic range. And on the high end, maybe 15, 16, or maybe even 17 stops of dynamic range. So cameras today have got a lot of latitude. They can capture a lot of information in a single scene. Just understanding what those limitations are is what's so important. So I did not need to exposure bracket these types of photographs when I was first getting started. This is just the edited version I've been working on. But here's another example. So this is from the Dolomites, my fall workshop last year, where we're starting to see a little bit of light pop in, and we're also getting a little bit of shadows down here as well. So you've got kind of a brightish light, kind of brightish clouds. You've got some darker shadows here. But even this type of a scene right here, you don't even need to really exposure bracket either. So understanding what you need to do versus what you don't need to do is absolutely imperative. But what I used to do, and what I see a lot of people do, especially on workshops, is that they exposure bracket everything, and it's always the same reason why, and it's the just in case I need to use it. And most of the time, you're probably not going to need to use it. So those are just 2 quick examples of scenes that you really don't need to exposure bracket. Now, scenes that you may want to exposure bracket, this is where it starts to get interesting. So right here, tons of very dark shadows all through here. in a sky that is fairly bright up here as well. So if we come over here to the develop module and we look at the histogram here, you're starting to see a lot of information piled up on the left side of the histogram to where the blacks and the shadows are indicated. And you're also starting to see a little bit of a spike over here where the highlights and the whites are indicated on the histogram as well. So this is the type of scenario where you're starting to get into that realm of maybe you're starting to get close to needing to exposure bracket this type of a scene. But even this right here isn't I should say a necessity. It's not a requirement. The camera that I used for this, which I believe was an A7R2 Sony, was even able to capture this in a single photograph. Like even if I bring the highlights all the way down, you can look in the sky and you can see that there's no area in the sky up here that is overexposed. Now, if I hit the shortcut key J, you can see that there are some areas of underexposed shadows down through here, which is definitely, it's a little bit of a problem. But the real culprit here is you really, really want to avoid overexposed highlights, or commonly referred to as blown out highlights. That's what you really want to avoid. And I'll show you here in a minute why that can just destroy a photograph. But underexposed shadows are definitely not good, but not nearly as bad as overexposed highlights are. And here is the final version of this photograph right here, which you can see I was able to, this is still that same exact photograph. And of course that there was no areas that are overexposed in the sky. And you can see that there was no areas where there's lacking any detail down here in the foreground either. Now here is another example, also from a trip to the Dolomites last year. All of this area up here in red, these are all overexposed highlights. So this type of a scene here, let me hit shortcut key I. You can see that my shutter speed is at 1/30th of a second. So if I sped this up a little bit and did 1/60th of a second, you can see that there's not quite as many overexposed highlights in the sky, but there is still a lot. Go a little bit faster, this is 1/125th of a second, and you can see that there's still areas of overexposed highlights in the sky here, and the area down here is almost completely dark, but you can still see what's happening. But if you look at the histogram here, you can see that the left side of the histogram up here is not pushed all the way over to the left of the histogram, which basically would be indicating underexposed shadows, or some people refer to them as crushed shadows or clipped shadows. There's none of that in the scene. You can also tell because there's none of that blue indicator anywhere down here either. But if you look over here on the right side of the histogram, there is a little bit of a spike right at the very edge. And when I go back and look at some of the other photographs, you can see the spike starts to grow a little bit higher. So that's really what you want to pay attention to. But even this type of a scene, you don't have to exposure bracket this type of a scene. You might want to though, just to create a cleaner image. So with the shadows being this dark, I would have to bring up the shadows probably to 100. I probably have to bring the black point up a fair amount as well. I'd have to bring the exposure up a fair amount, bring the highlights down quite a bit as well, to a point to where we're starting to get a more usable file right here. And the reason why you might want to exposure bracket this scene is because when you have areas that are very, very dark, crushed shadows or clipped shadows maybe, and you bring up so much shadow recovery and you have to bring up the exposure so much, a lot of times that can create noise in those darker areas of your photograph. So using exposure bracketing techniques, that's a way to create a somewhat of a cleaner file. But if we're only talking about exposure, even in this scenario, I was able to get almost all of this photograph done in a single photograph, a single image. But where those overexposed highlights really come in is this right here. This is pretty interesting. So let me just reset this. If we look at this area up here, this is the area that Lightroom is saying this is overexposed. These are clipped highlights right through here. So if you remember the shape of this, just remember that basic shape. I'm gonna turn the clipping indicator off and I'm gonna bring the highlights all the way down. Let's bring the contrast all the way up so you can easily see this. Maybe bring the clarity up a little bit. See that area right through here? That's the exact same shape of that clipping indicator that we saw, which is basically telling me that those areas were overexposed, which we knew because it was highlighted in red, but there's no information captured in those areas. There was no info captured. It was pure white. There's no way to resolve that. There's no way to bring that back. It is gone. That is why overexposed highlights can destroy a photograph. Underexposed shadows are definitely something you should try and avoid, but it is not a killer of your photograph. But the overexposed highlights are definitely something that can cause you a lot of problems. And if we reset this again and I hit the shortcut key J, See, there's the overexposed area right through there. And the same thing, all of these areas up here that are indicated in red, there is no information captured in any of those. So that is an example of when you may want to exposure bracket. Now, this example here, this is where you absolutely have to exposure bracket. And I'll show you a very, very easy way to determine this when you're on location. So this scene right here, this was captured at 1/10 of a second. You can see that this whole area up here is overexposed. If I turn the clipping indicator off, this is the overall scene, but that's at 1/10 of a second. This is at 1/30th of a second. So, and once again, you know, there's a much smaller area that is overexposed up here now, and there is a little area of underexposed shadows down here as well. If I bring the exposure down a little bit, yep, we're getting to the point to where we've almost removed all of that overexposed highlights in the sky. But now look what happened down here. This is all underexposed. These are all clipped or crushed shadows. And then if I want to resolve those clipped shadows, bring the exposure back, and now we have no clipped shadows, but now we have a huge overexposed sky. And that's kind of the telltale sign, is when you can't capture an image that has either or I should say appropriate detail in the highlights and appropriate detail in the shadows at the same exact time. That's where exposure bracketing comes in. And now here's a real easy way to tell this when you're on location. If you look at your histogram when you're on location, if you have your histogram has a spike on the left side and it's pushed all the way to the left, and you also have an area that is pushed to the right, so you've got a spike basically on both sides, that is your camera telling you, hey, photographer, I cannot capture this in a single frame. You have to exposure bracket this. No matter what you do to the camera settings, if you can't resolve the spike on both sides at the same time, then you should definitely exposure bracket that. And just for clarity purposes, when I say at the same time, is if you have the spike on the highlights here and you've got a big spike on the shadows, when that is occurring at the same exact time and there's no way to fix that. So if I bring up the exposure, see that? Now I've got no spike on the left side, but I've got a spike on the right side. And if I bring this back down here, and now I don't have a spike on the right, now I don't have a spike on the right side, but now I've got a huge spike on the left side. So whenever you see that, when you're on location, when you see your histogram, it's got a big pile of information on the shadows of the blacks, and you also have a big pile of information on the highlights and the whites on the right side of the histogram. When you see those two things and there's no way to resolve them in at the same time, you should definitely exposure bracket that scene. And that's a great way. That's what I always try and look for when I'm on location. And I've been using my cameras long enough to where I can almost just look at a scene and tell if I'm gonna need to exposure bracket it or not. And I think a lot of that just comes with practice from using your gear. Now, what a proper histogram really looks like, and when I say proper, I shouldn't use the term proper, but a well-balanced histogram, this is a raw file from my Greenland workshop last year. But you see how all the information is kind of piled up in the center here. There's nothing even remotely close to the blacks or the shadows. There's nothing even remotely close to the highlights or the whites over here. Very, very balanced exposure. Now, right here is another one. This one right here could be a little bit tricky because you do have a bright sky up here at the top, and then you do have some areas down here that are darker. But if you look up here, you can tell that there's no spike over here on the left side in the blacks or the shadows. And there's also no huge spike all the way over here on the whites or the highlights. The highlights are starting to get a little hot. They are starting to get a little bright, but you can tell when I bring the highlights down, there's detail all through there. And if I hit the shortcut key J and turn on the clipping indicator, it's on right now, nothing is indicated anywhere on here. Now, if I bring up the exposure a whole lot, you see now the clipping indicator starts to kick in. But here, it's a very, very clean image. And when I bring the highlights down, you can see that all that beautiful detail is retained in the sky as well. So getting comfortable and understanding the relationship between light and shadows just by looking at a scene, but most importantly is looking at your histogram and really being laser focused to the extreme left of your histogram and the extreme right of your histogram. The black point in the shadows versus the highlights in the white point, paying attention to those and trying to avoid big spikes on either side of those is going to be your indicator as to whether or not you need to exposure bracket a scene. Like I said, I used to exposure bracket everything and I really never needed to. And now I feel more confident understanding exactly, one, what the limitations of my camera gear are, my camera specifically is, But I also understand my own skill set, and I'm more confident now in being able to read a histogram, being able to read a scene, and being able to identify whether or not I need to exposure bracket a scene. And I think that that has ultimately made me a better photographer. So before I do, that was a lot of information, but before I do wrap up this week's video, I do just want to say a big thanks to the longtime sponsor of the channel, which is Squarespace, who I use for all of my website and e-commerce needs. Squarespace provides a robust and beautiful online platform to develop your website. You can showcase your photography using Squarespace's professional portfolio designs and display your work using customizable galleries in order to make it your own. And with Squarespace's online store feature, you'll have access to all the tools you'll need to start selling your physical, digital, or service products online immediately. You can even use Squarespace's new asset library so you can upload, organize, and access all your content from a single place in order to easily find and use them across the entire Squarespace platform. So if you're looking to start a new website or possibly upgrade your current website, check out squarespace.com/Mark Denney for a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. So if you do have any questions about exposure bracketing, please leave those in the comment section below, and I will do my best to get back in touch with you as quickly as humanly possible. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you carving out a little bit of time to spend it with me here today, talking about all things related to perfectly exposed landscape photos. And I really do appreciate it, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.